In this chapter, I'm going to show you how to build a vegetable garden without ever digging into the soil. We're going to build a raised bed. I'll show you how and which seeds to plant in it and the materials you need to get started. So let's get to it. A raised bed is any garden that is elevated a little bit above ground, so you don't have to dig into your soil to plant, and you don't have to bend over as much when you're gardening. Raised beds are such a fantastic way to garden. They're easy to work in. It's actually going to heat up earlier in the spring and cool down slower in the fall. You get to choose the perfect soil mix. You get a little more soil so your plant's roots can grow nice and deep, and they drain better. There's so many different benefits to growing in raised beds. Now, you can build a raised bed out of pretty much anything. Metal, you could use brick or cement, but a simple wooden bed may be best. It's classic, it's easy to build, and it looks amazing when it's finally set up and growing. You really have three main wood choices for your raised beds. On the lower end, you have Douglas fir, which will last you 5 to 7 years. Good choice if you're a renter or if you just don't want to break the bank when you're building your first bed. And there's cedar, lasts maybe 7, 15 years or so. And then we've got redwood, one of the best types of wood. It'll last 15 to 20 plus years if you take care of it. A little more pricey, but sometimes that price is worth it if it's gonna last a long time. I've chosen redwood for my type of wood for this bed, 12-foot long sections by a foot tall, and I have 2 of those. Let's talk about the tools we need to get started. The basics, a pencil, and a measuring tape. We have to make sure we're building to the right dimension. I'm gonna use a circular saw. You could use a miter saw, circular saw, or really anything that you have that'll cut through a 1-foot board. Safety equipment, of course, is a must, and we're gonna go with 3-inch outdoor-rated decking screws. We've got our drill and some drill bits just in case we need to throw a pilot hole in there. I always like to. Anything that is smaller than the screw will work, so I'm going with a 3/32 inch drill bit. A square always keeps things nice and tidy, and then we have some landscape fabric and some hardware cloth, and then a staple gun to staple them to your bed. Now that we know the materials we need, let's jump into the build. So what I'm gonna do is take my circular saw, put a square on the board, and cut a 4-foot section off of each, which leaves me with 2 4-foot sections, 2 8-foot sections. Those shorter ones are gonna go on the short sides, and the 8-foot ones will go on the long sides. I've cut my boards. I've got them exactly where I want them in the garden. Always good to do a little dry fit first. Next step, I'm gonna cut a couple 10-inch sections of 4x4, but I'm gonna put them in the corners for added stability. Then we're gonna drill 3 pilot holes, spaced evenly apart in the corners of each of the pieces of wood, and we'll sink in our deck screws to fasten the corners together. I get a lot of questions about how big should my bed be? As a general rule of thumb, I don't like going wider than about 4 feet. As far as height, I typically recommend at least 12 inches, although you can go much higher if you want to. Now that we have our frame together, we could just start filling it up with soil. But I'm gonna show you 2 things that help take this raised bed to the next level. Number 1, a layer of landscape fabric. This is gonna help keep the weeds down. If you don't have this, something simple like cardboard is perfectly fine. Number 2, hardware cloth. This is gonna help prevent any moles, voles, digging pests from coming up and ruining our day. Both of these products should be widely available at your local hardware store or big box store. On what is gonna be the bottom of our bed, we'll staple the landscape fabric down first. We'll follow up with the hardware cloth, staple it in, and cut off the excess hardware cloth with some tin snips and excess landscape fabric with scissors or a utility knife. Our last step is to put it down and fill it up with soil. A lot of people wonder, how do you actually know how much soil that you need? It's actually really simple math. Length of your bed, width of your bed, and height of your bed. Multiply those together, you have your cubic feet of soil, then you know exactly how much you should be filling your bed with. As for what kind of soil to use, you're gonna want some sort of organic mix to get your veggies off to a good start. If you're going taller than 12 inches, a fantastic tip that I have, and I've used many times in my own garden, is to take logs, sticks, twigs, anything like that, and fill up the bottom half of the bed. Then take your good mix and slide that over the top half so your plants still have something nice to grow in, but you saved yourself a ton of money. For a good dose of extra nutrition for our soil, I'm gonna dump on a nice compost mix. And what that's gonna do is just add a little bit more nutrients to the soil. You know, we think about feeding our plants, but really if we feed the soil and set that up correctly, it does a lot of the work for us. The final step is adding probably the most important ingredient if you think about it, and that would be mulch. Now, I did not give mulch enough respect when I first started gardening, but man, does it save a lot of time and potentially a lot of money. We have some redwood bark fines here. Nice and fluffy, mixed in with these nice large chunks, and really that's what you're looking for. You want something about inch, 2 inches, 3 inches on top of the soil to protect those sensitive roots and hold that moisture in so you don't have to water as much and you really let the soil do the work. With mulch, you have a lot of different options. You don't have to stick with something like this redwood bark. You can use other forms of bark. You can use grass clippings, old leaves. I've seen people do shredded newspaper, old mail. You can even shred up cardboard and lay that on top. Anything organic that's dried out and you can easily spread it over the top of the soil. I'm choosing to put the mulch down first. That way, when I pull it aside and transplant in my seedlings, it's already away from the stem of the plant, which can help prevent disease. If you want to do it the other way, it's totally fine. Just make sure you don't push the mulch right up next to the stems of your seedlings. Now that our mulch is spread out, I'm going to give this garden a healthy drink of water. We're going to water this in before we put plants in, just to get it nice and moist and ready to accept our new seedlings. And speaking of, we actually have to learn how to start seeds, which is what we're going to do right now. There are so many seeds you can start in a raised bed, but I'm going to show you some that I started in preparation for this new garden. You can grow pretty much anything. I have probably 200 seed packets just in this box right here, and I have a lot of these boxes. I'm going to do peppers, tomatoes, and cucumbers. I'm going to pull out a couple tomato seeds. We can pour them out of the packet and take a look at them. They kind of look dead, but in fact, they're just dormant. They're waiting for the right conditions. An ample amount of heat and enough moisture to kickstart those life processes. So what you want to do is grab some fine soil, not like our potting mix out there. You want it to be nice and fine grained. And we'll make a slight depression in the soil. We need to bury them just a little bit so they can stay nice and moist, about 1/8 of an inch to 1/2 an inch deep, depending on the size of the seed, with the smaller seeds being buried shallower. And we'll just cover that up with soil, we'll water it in, and we've started the process. When you're starting seeds in containers, you can grow them just about anywhere, including inside your home, which means you're more attentive, you'll care for them, and they're less prone to the fluctuations of the environment, which means that they're off to a healthier start so they get in your garden and they really grow well. When starting seeds, one of the hardest skills to practice is actually patience. All of these seeds take different amounts of time to germinate. Tomatoes, 6 to 8 days or so, but to get it to this point has taken 1.5 months. This basil right here, 5 to 10 days to pop out of the ground, but 2 to 3 weeks just to look like that. A general rule of thumb is when a seedling has 3 or 4 sets of leaves, it's ready to get out and plant in the garden. In fact, just like me, I'm sure these seedlings are a little impatient to get in the garden, so let's get to it. Got all of my seedlings out in the front yard. I'm ready to start putting them in the raised bed. The first thing we're going to do is start out with our larger plants. Our sun's coming in from this direction, and so everything that's tall should be on the back so it doesn't shade everything else out. When you're taking a plant out of the pot, just turn it upside down, uncover it, and we've got a nice tomato plant here. For this plant and all potted plants, you want to loosen the roots because they can become compacted when they're growing in the pot. Tomatoes have the ability to grow more roots along this main stem. So I'm going to plant it about this deep. Let's not forget, we'll grab a little handful of some organic granular fertilizer, sprinkle that in, cover our tomato up really nicely, and we're going to have rapid growth. I'm going to go with this cucumber right here. It's the biggest plant out of the remaining ones. Cucumbers will vine like crazy. So we have to make sure, again, that we've planted it in an area where it's not going to block anything off, and eventually we're going to have to throw something in here to support it. Every plant has its own requirement for spacing. Tomatoes, about 1 foot or so. Cucumbers, 2, 3 feet. One thing I always like to do is a quick internet search just to confirm. Make a mistake in this transplanting phase, and you won't know you made it until it comes time to harvest, and you've got some plants that might be suffering from some pests or diseases because they're a little too close together. We've got quite a bit left to plant out in this bed, and even by the time we're done, it's not going to look completely full. You have to think about what this will look like when it's grown in. So don't think that when you transplant things in and it looks a little sparse that you've made a mistake. Now that our plants are transplanted in place, spaced properly, it's time to give them a nice drink. Come in really low, 20, 30 seconds on each of these guys, and then we'll move on down the line. One of the most common questions I get is how often do you actually water the raised bed? And one of the old recommendations was about an inch of water a week, but if you just move the mulch away and stick your finger down in the soil and it's dry about 3 or 4 inches deep, it's time to give it a good healthy drink. On average, that ends up being a couple times a week, but it really does depend on your unique growing conditions, your unique weather. So you have to build that green thumb and that sense for when it's time to water. In this chapter, I showed you how to build a raised bed, how to start seeding and where to place those seeds, and then all the tools you need to get started. So in about 4 or 5 weeks, I'll start pulling some early tomatoes, early peppers, and cucumbers out of this bed, which will be awesome. And if you follow the steps, you'll be able to do the exact same thing in your garden.